Hello everyone, welcome to the Whose Story Is It Anyway? Understanding and Applying Depth of the Author in Fandom. My name's Jemima and I will be your panel host today. I do apologise in advance for the raspiness of my voice. I recently caught a cold for the first time in about 10 years, so bear with me. Hopefully I will not spontaneously cough. I should be fine though. Anyway. So, what we're going to be talking about in this panel today is something that I'm quite passionate about as a literary scholar myself. And it's something that I think we have all at some point encountered within fandom, and also something that we actually implement within fandom without necessarily knowing that we're doing it a lot of the time. And I see questions all the time from people who say, okay, but what actually is depth of the author? So today I hope to answer some of those questions. We're going to be looking at what depth of the author actually is, how we implement it, and also raise some questions about whether it always is okay or appropriate for us to be using depth of the author within fandom. And I really want to make you more conscious about depth of the author and indeed about literary criticism in a wider context. So, before we begin, I have a question for all of you. Now, feel free to jot your answer down in the comments or just think about it to yourself. I don't mind. And don't worry, this isn't a magical trick question. All answers are good answers. I just want to have you think about this. So, my question for you is, who owns a story once it's been released? So, once a story is out into the world, who actually owns it at that point? Now, you might think that, well, it's obviously the creator, the author, who still owns it. They made it, so they own it. You might think it's the publisher if it's, been officially published. So, official book publications, the publisher is the owner. Or maybe you are more inclined to think that the audience or the reader, the consumer, is the one who actually owns the story. Or maybe it might be the wider culture that surrounds the story. Whatever context that might be in. Or maybe you think it's some sort of combination of the above, or maybe you actually think that someone or something else owns the story. So I just want you to think about this question, and feel free, as I said, feel free to share your thoughts. There isn't a wrong answer, so please don't feel shy about sharing. Now, I'm asking you this question because this is actually what I believe is at the very heart of depth of the author. Because depth of the author, as quoted, is the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, when we're talking about depth of the author, we're actually referring to a 1967 essay written by the French literary critic and theorist Roland Barthes. Now, in this essay, he essentially argued that the author's intent should not control interpretation. So, what I mean is that to Barthes, meaning is created by the reader, so the text does not equal the author. Now, I need to make this very clear that this is not the same as separating art from the artist. I see this get confused all the time, and I completely understand why people make this mistake, but I really need to stress that these are two separate concepts. So, just to reiterate, depth of the author is talking about how authorial intent does not take primacy over reader interpretation. So, what's most important is how the reader interprets a story and not what the author was intending. However, separating the art from the artist is more about making an active choice to enjoy and consume a piece of art, despite the fact that you have some sort of personal, moral, or sort of ideological opposement to the artist. So, an example would be choosing to still enjoy and, actively consume and interact with Harry Potter, for example, even though you are completely against the author's, everything. So that's what separating art from the artist is. Whereas, to give an example of Death of the Author, when I was a lot younger, I was really into Ender's Game. And I actually found that the main character had a really similar sort of personal journey that a trans person would experience. And so I sort of viewed this character as being a sort of trans allegory because I could see so many connections. And I did this while knowing full well that the author did not intend this. And I know the author did not intend this because it sadly turned out that the author was extremely homophobic, and I can't imagine that they weren't transphobic either. So that is what Death of the Author is about. It's not necessarily about being morally or personally against the author, like separating the art from the artist. It's more about the reader or the consumer's personal interpretation versus the author's intent. Now, obviously, there may be instances where both of these things are at play, that's fine, but they're still two completely different concepts, so make sure that you're referring to the right one when you're talking about either. The reason that Barthes is such an important figure and why Death of the Author is still so relevant today is because before he published this essay, literary criticism, by and large, was really primarily and almost exclusively centered on the author's biography and how we could use this to identify the author's intention, as well as the wider historical context. So when we used to analyze texts within the field, we would do a really big deep dive on the author and find out everything we could about them and their life. So where they were born, when they were born, what was the cultural and historical context surrounding them like, what sort of socio-economic background were they from, what sort of family were they from, what did they do as a job, all these sorts of things. Did they have any political affiliations? All these sort of things. Every scrap of information you could find about an author we would try and use in order to understand what we thought the author was trying to say within their work. Now, obviously, this is something that we still very much do in the literary criticism field. However, at the point that Barthes was writing, this was pretty much the only thing we were doing. So the primary question at this point was always, okay, what did the author mean? Now, Barthes, being a bit more of a radical, so to speak, decided to say that, no, we should shift the focus and actually ask, okay, what does the text do outside of the author? What does the text mean to us as readers? What do we take away from this text? Because, let's be honest, most of the time when someone picks up a book and reads it, they don't go away and do a deep dive research into the author in order to understand the book. You know, they come up with their own interpretation without really thinking about the author. Now, obviously, when you read a text, you might be able to pick up on a couple of things that the author might be trying to do, but at the end of the day, we can't know for sure, and that doesn't really matter, because what we take away from the text is what matters to us as a reader, and is what really impacts our reading experience. And that's what Barthes tells us. He says, well, the author biography, their intentions, etc., those are fine to look at, but they should not be the primary focus. The primary focus should always be on how the reader feels. And because each individual reader is going to take something different away from the text, that's what makes it more exciting and less restrictive when it comes to analysing and exploring these works. So that is why Barthes is such an important figure within literary criticism, because he really was a sort of trailblazer, at least in the sort of mainstream literary critical field, about saying, hey, that's all fine and dandy, but what about this? So that is why he is still relevant today. Now, what does all of this have to do with fandom? Well, I imagine at some point while I was talking, you all were probably thinking to yourself, this sounds a lot like what we do in fandom, right? Because Barthes challenges these notions and says, well, this approach limits interpretation, because it assumes that there is only one correct meaning, and that's the author's, and that's not true. He proposes instead that meaning is plural, that it's unstable, and that it belongs to readers. We are constantly practicing death of the author, aren't we? We are constantly saying, I know that's not canon, but the text doesn't support that, but I reject that retcon, etc., right? That's death of the author in action. Because fandom says that the text itself matters more than the creator's later commentary. Or sometimes we even say our emotional truth matters more than either. Right, so we as fans, we're constantly rejecting creator statements, we're constantly reinterpreting canon, we're constantly creating alternative readings, and we're essentially turning meaning into a collaborative practice rather than a hierarchical one. Because what is at the heart of Death of the Author, and indeed the way that we interact as fans, is that authors themselves obviously matter as people, we never say they don't, but that once a work exists independently in the world, its meaning is created within the interaction between text and reader. So, in other words, what it means to you is valid, even if the author says otherwise. I also want to use this opportunity to highlight a really common misconception and misuse of Death of the Author that I see a lot within fandom spaces. So, it's important to remember that Death of the Author is still a literary framework. So when it comes to reader interpretation, you still have to back up those readings with textual evidence. So you can't just make something up completely out of thin air and say, well, it's canon because Death of the Author. No, that's not how these things work. So just like with other forms of literary or other media analysis, you're still looking for things within the work to back up your interpretation, to back up your reading. So you still will need to bring up things from the text in order to justify your reading. Your interpretation may not have been what the author intended, but you're still able to back up that reading using textual readings and analysis, right? So you're still looking within the text for evidence. I've seen posts where people will present an idea they have as something that is canonically factual, and when someone else comes along and says, "Oh, I don't think that's true," instead of just simply saying, "Oh, I know it's not actually true, I just like the idea of it," or "I think it's more fun to think of it that way," people will sometimes double down and claim that no, it's definitely in the text, and when they're asked to provide evidence, suddenly you're blocked, or suddenly you're not letting people have fun anymore, or all these very strange accusations. But anyway, hopefully that is clear. I'm not saying that you can't have fun and enjoy stories and make up your own alternate versions, that you can't enjoy non-canonical ideas, but that doesn't change the fact that it's not death of the author. Be sure that you're actually using this term correctly. So I'm going to briefly do a little case study that I believe quite a few of you will be familiar with. It's not BL, but it's arguably at least BL adjacent. So we are going to look at the supernatural fandom, right? Now, the reason I'm picking this is because of particularly questions around queer readings of the characters. So, for many years, fans of Supernatural have interpreted subtextual relationships that the showrunners themselves either denied or purposely kind of left ambiguous, right? And even the actors themselves sort of got involved with their own little sort of wink wink nudge nudges, especially during panels and stuff. So we have Supernatural, a very long running series with really strong fan engagement. And there were constant conflicts between canon romantic arcs and sort of fan preferred relationships. So I refer to Destiel on the screen here, Dean and Castiel, the ship, and how there was at times really intense discourse over authorial intent versus the queer readings. So since the character of Castiel was introduced in the second season, there has constantly been shipping between him and the character Dean. Now, obviously, we always are shipping things, whether it's canon or not. However, the more the show progressed, the more it really seemed that these readings were becoming more and more credible, right? Any of you who were there at the time know exactly what I'm talking about. And so the tension here lies that when creators say, well, that wasn't intentional, but fans say, well, actually, it's there in the text, or, in this case, it's there on the screen, we have to answer this question, and that question is, well, who's right? Because under death of the author, intentionality doesn't determine legitimacy. So if the text supports it, then the interpretation stands. So, just to reiterate, canon is official source material, and fanon is widely accepted and or used fan interpretation. So examples of this are character head canons, relationship dynamics, reinterpreted backstories, things like that. Fanon emerges when enough readers share an interpretation that it becomes socially real. So, things like fanfiction don't just extend the stories, they interrogate the story. It rewrites endings, it resurrects characters, it establishes or or indeed heightens queer relationships and centers marginalized identities. So fanon, fills the representation gaps. It corrects perceived narrative harms and creates shared community meaning. And in doing so, fans aren't just consuming the media that they enjoy, they're redistributing the narrative authority. So when we look at fan fiction as applied to the author, we can really see how these go hand in hand, because obviously in fanfic we're rewriting endings, we're fixing perceived flaws with the story, we're often centering marginalized identities, and we're always exploring the what ifs. Now, I think all of us can say that we have or currently are fans of works that don't always have the most problematic free content, right? And sometimes that's part of the charm of the story, but sometimes we love a work in spite of its flaws. And so one of the great things about fan fiction is that we can really go about rectifying these potential harms and sort of making it our own. So, especially when it comes to marginalized identities, right? So, if there's any content in a story that could perhaps be perceived as derogatory or sensitive toward a marginalized group, then we can always go about fixing these things, at least from our perspective. Doing so, we are effectively, as fans, becoming co-authors to the stories that we love, right? Because when it comes to fan fiction, obviously the original work, lives a life of its own and can not be altered directly, but through our works in fan fiction, we can create alternate dual stories so that we are just as a part of the storytelling as the original author is. It's also key to understanding how authority shifts from the original creator to the community, because as we've been talking about, when a story goes out into the world, it doesn't entirely stay its own thing, right? We were talking about this at the very beginning about who owns a story once it's out into the masses. And this proves once again that there is at least some sort of co-ownership between the original and the fan. And we see the same thing happening when it comes to fan art and visual representations. So in a similar manner, when fan artists are redesigning the characters, reimagining their race, their gender, etc., that ties back in a lot of the times to rectifying those potentially harmful narratives that were in the original story, and using it as a sort of reclamation. And fans are also really good at depicting subtext as text. So, as we talked about earlier, when it comes to looking within subtext, and I think visual culture plays an extra role in that it actually solidifies fanon, because fan art is one of the most visible forms of fan engagement, right? We've all seen fan art of things that we are both fans and not fans of. There are entire shows and books and stories that I have only ever consumed via fanworks. I've never seen the originals, but just through the fan work, I feel as though I know the story. And I think this is an experience that we've all encountered at some point, right? And so this is a really interesting dynamic in that this visual culture oftentimes actually circulates faster than the canon. So I have definitely watched a show just because I saw some really gorgeous fan art of it. And I may have never heard of it before, but just off this one piece of art, I then became a fan of this thing, and that speaks to the wider culture. Now, this shift becomes incredibly empowering as a fan, because what we're essentially doing when we utilize depth of the author within fandom, we are democratizing storytelling. So we are validating marginalized readings. We are allowing marginalized people to see themselves within texts that can often exclude them. We're creating community through shared meaning making and allowing healing through these reinterpretations, right? And it's also this wider general encouragement of creative participation. So, actively encouraging one another to have fun with the things that we enjoy by analyzing them, by writing fan fiction, writing fan art, making new friends, all these sorts of things, right? And so in doing that, fans can essentially claim a sort of emotional ownership. So while we may not physically own the stories that we love, we have an emotional attachment and we emotionally become, again, co-owners. And we also have a cultural ownership because when we talk about the wider context of media, of literature within the wider world, these stories do become really key parts of culture, whether that be a national culture, a queer culture, anything like that. As a fan, when you're part of a fandom, what you're essentially becoming is not just a mere consumer, you are becoming an active participant of the story. And that is very empowering because you are playing a role in a story that means something to you. Now, we've spent quite a lot of time talking about how empowering and common it is to use death of the author within fandom. So we're going to now have a little look about whether it is always a good thing, right? Is it always appropriate to be using death of the author, and how do we determine whether this is actually good practice or not? So we're going to have a little bit of a more nuanced look into the theory as well as some criticisms that have come. Ever since Barthes first published his essay, there have been numerous critiques. Here's the thing. Sometimes death of the author ends up becoming this idea that, the creator owes me my preferred ending, or I don't care what cultural context has shaped this story. I'm free to say whatever I like about it and view it in whatever way, regardless of, any sort of background it comes from. And sometimes in doing so, we actually end up erasing marginalized creators whose lived experiences deeply inform their work, for example. And so we really need to sit down and think about whether these things are actually okay to do, because there is a big question at the heart of a lot of criticism when it comes to death of the author, and that is, when does empowerment actually turn to appropriation? When I say this, I'm not saying that we should be shutting down different interpretations, absolutely not. But what I'm saying is we should be asking ourselves what responsibility comes with this interpretive power. When I say this, we're thinking about how there have been critiques about the loss of context and intent. So if we ignore authorial intent completely, we actually end up having analysis that loses its connection to the historical and cultural context in which the story was written. And so many critics have actually argued that intent is vital for understanding and is not just a supposed constraint. So when we have stories that are very deeply rooted in historical or cultural contexts, if we come along and essentially say, well, I'm just going to choose to ignore all of that, are we really doing the story justice? To give you an example, I'm a BL scholar, And as you can probably tell by my accent, I am British. I will also tell you that I am very much white. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because when it comes to my BL scholarship, I actually primarily look at Danmei, so Chinese BL. For those of you who have seen my Danmei panel that I did last CitrusCon, you will know that Danmei is really, really heavily rooted in Chinese culture and history a lot of the time. And so for me as a white British scholar, if I were to analyze a Danmei and I just decided, well, death of the author, I don't care what the author's intent was when it comes to incorporating all these cultural references, etc. I'm just going to use my white Western lens to read this entire text and to view it only in that way. Do you think that this is an appropriate thing for me to do? Do you? Now, I'm asking. This isn't a rhetorical question. I'm hoping you will think about this. Would this be appropriate of me? Better yet, would this be a form of neo-colonialism? Because if I am essentially dominating the narrative of a minority author and saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know the story that you wrote, I know it better than you because of my Western superiority, would this really be an okay thing for me to do? So that's an example. And we actually see this in action, so if you actually go ahead and look at literary scholars who do in fact use death of the author in their analysis, what you'll often find is that pretty much all of these scholars are very selective about the texts you use death of the author on. Very, very rarely will you ever see death of the author used on a text that is very overtly political or ideological, for example, because those things are so strongly interwoven and ingrained in the story that the idea of completely ignoring why the author has done this just doesn't seem correct. Seems ludicrous, doesn't it? I think we have all come across at least one instance where we've seen someone talk about, a book, a movie, TV show, etc., and thought, wow, this person really missed the point, didn't they? Right? Wow, this person really doesn't understand this character. This person really didn't understand the themes of this story. Right? We've all had those experiences. We've all seen those weird men who idolize, Patrick Bateman and the guys from Fight Club and just completely missed the very in-your-face critiques about masculinity, for example, right? And so, how can we really laugh at those people, but then in turn kind of do the exact same thing that they do in some instances? So, just think about whether your use of death of the author in the specific context that you are using it is appropriate, or is it appropriative? This is something that a lot of post-colonial scholars in particular have heavily critiqued when it comes to death of the author, especially in recent years. And, this is very much something to think about when we talk about BL, because for the vast majority of us, we're consuming BL that exists from a culture that we are not a part of. We have heavily discussed within, BL spaces how a lot of the time when people critique the boys love genre, they end up coming across as really quite racist because a lot of the so-called critiques that we see are, bigotry towards queer culture that exists from a place that they are not familiar with, right? We've all seen, the Alice Osemans of the world who said that, oh, well, that Asian BL stuff is all fetishistic and it's not like our pure Western queer stories. We've all seen those really icky and gross comments, right? And we don't want to end up doing a similar thing that they do, right? So, again, not saying you can't use Death of the Author, but just be mindful about when you are using it and how you are using it. There's also the problem of unrestricted interpretation. So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but sometimes the Death of the Author theory can, in fact, lead to, quote, extreme interpretations. So when fans might alter facts in a story or even just straight up invent meanings that lack textual evidence, and thereby ignoring the foundational shared or common reading of a story. Because the thing is with Death of the Author is within this framework, every single interpretation of a story is inherently viewed as equal under Death of the Author, right? And the problem with that is that while everyone is equally entitled to their opinion, that does not mean that all opinions are of equal value. Now, what do I mean when I say this? I'm saying that obviously we as individuals, no one is more entitled to an opinion, to a thought, as anyone else. But that does not mean that everyone's individual opinion has the same weighted value. So, if I were to ask two people, for example, what are your top 5 BL of all time? What do you think are the top 5 best BL series of all time? Now, these two people are both going to be equally entitled to the opinion that they give. However, if I tell you one of them has only watched 10 BL series ever, and the other one has watched 300, I'm personally going to put more weight and value on the person who has seen 300 BLs as opposed to the one who has seen 10. Not because I think that the person who has seen 300 is more entitled to their opinion, but I think that they have more knowledge of the genre and am therefore going to be more inclined to listen to their opinion than the other person. Does that make sense? And then some other critics note that Barthes relies on this sort of idealized romantic conception of the author as an omnipotent, godlike creator. By attacking this exaggerated absolute authority, the theory of Death of the Author essentially claims to liberate the reader. But critics, on the other hand, suggest that this view of authorship actually fails to reflect the real nuanced, collaborative, and socially situated reality of writing. The critique is more about how Barthes is essentially arguing against this idealized concept of the author that doesn't actually exist in reality. They are saying, well, when we analyze a text, we never we're never saying that the author is this perfect godlike being, because we are constantly critiquing and challenging them all the time. And so Barthes is sort of arguing against a concept that doesn't actually exist in reality. No one truly views an author as this truly perfect being whose work has no flaws whatsoever. That doesn't actually happen in reality. So that's another critique. Essentially, critics by and large contend that a text's origin remains essential, making it impossible to fully sever a work from its creator. So, the way we apply these critiques to fandom is that we see these tensions arise when it comes to things like the harassment of creators and the sense of entitlement that some fans end up possessing. So, when a work ends up having an ending, for example, that is unpopular with a fan base, or at least a subset of the fan base, some people can get quite nasty. I think we've all seen this to some degree. Erasing creators' identities because the fan base is unhappy with them. This also leads to things like moral policing within fandom. I think this is, again, something we've all witnessed or experienced in some form or another. And then also, this ends up sort of having a ripple effect and causing conflict between fan communities. And so there is this question of, okay, well, does rejecting authorial intent sometimes become rejecting accountability? Now, with that being said, here are some ethical grey areas that I want you all to ponder on. This is, again, not a trick question. These are just things I think it's always important to keep in mind and to ask ourselves when we consider using death of the author. So, when does reinterpretation become distortion? Are there any limits to transformative work? So, fanfiction, fan art, etc. Does context ever matter? So, historical, political, cultural. Should we ever fully detach art from artists? Now, I'm not referring to separating the art from the artist. I'm talking about the detachment of the author from the story, so the authorial intent from the story. Should we ever fully detach them? Or should there be a balancing act between fan or reader interpretation and the author's intent? And how do we go about balancing these things? Now, regarding death of the author and accountability, what we are essentially trying to do is rejecting the idea that the author controls the meaning, so all meaning, that the author is the only one in control. Now, what this does not mean is that we are rejecting responsibility for harmful narratives, and we are not rejecting critique of problematic content. Because as fans, we often use the theory to critique power structures. But it's important to remember that sometimes we end up weaponizing it selectively, so referring back to creator harassment, moral policing, etc. Now, one last question that's important to ask when it comes to death of the author and its critiques is, can the author really be dead anymore? Now, what I mean when I ask this question is that at the time that Barthes wrote his essay in 1967, things like social media, direct fan and creator interactions, and instant commentary by and large did not exist. Because nowadays, we have authors who use social media. Many of them use it pretty frequently, and so they often see the way fans are engaging with their work. They see the fan fiction, they see the fan art, they see the meta posts, they see the headcanons, they see their analyses. And the authors are able to actually comment in real time about this. And the authors are also able to talk directly to fans and have fans directly talk to them. Fans are able to directly ask authors about their works, about their characters, about their writing processes, which are things that, when Barthes was writing, didn't really exist. There was no direct contact between creator and fan by and large. If a reader reinterpreted an author's work in a way that the author did not intend, the author really didn't have any way of knowing about it or being able to comment about it or be upset about it or anything. But nowadays, this is happening all the time, and this really changes the way that we interact with and engage with the works that we enjoy, and also the works that we produce ourselves. Because even when it comes to TV shows, showrunners respond live to fan interactions, and we've even seen times where entire scripts have been altered in order to try and please fan bases, and this has had varying degrees of success. And so it was very easy in Barthes' time to say, well, the author's dead because, there was no way to interact with the author as if they were in fact a living person, at least conceptually. But now that there's so much one-to-one interaction, how can we possibly say that the author is truly dead when they're responding to us directly? So that's another question we have to ask ourselves. Now, branching off from this point, we also need to consider the role of the fan today. So, modern fans are not just consumers of the things that they enjoy, but they are critics. They are creators, they are activists, and they are archivists. So, fans are not just passive observers by any means. We as fans don't just love these stories, we extend them, preserve them, and challenge them. And that changes culture. So now we're going to circle back to the very first question I asked you at the beginning of the panel. I once again ask you, who ultimately owns a story? And with this question, I also want to ask you, is canon more valid than fanon? Should creators listen to fans? Can death of the author coexist with respecting creators? And when does reinterpretation become harmful? Now, if you would like to answer any of these questions in the comments, feel free to do so. But ultimately, these are the questions I want you to take away with you and decide for yourselves what you think. There is no right or wrong answer here. Okay, now let's pivot to something hopefully a little more fun with a little game. So we're going to be playing Is It Death of the Author? So I'm going to have a little scenario on the screen, and I just want you to decide if you think that this is an example of death of the author or not. No pressure if you get it wrong, this is a learning experience. There's going to be 6 of these, so let's see how you do. So, nice and easy one to start. So, the following scenario is, after publishing their novel, an author says in an interview that the villain was meant to be the true hero all along. Now, fans argue that the text clearly presents the villain as cruel and selfish, and so they refuse to reinterpret the book based on the interview. Is this death of the author? Are the fans utilizing death of the author? Yes or no? Give you a few seconds to fill in your responses. Feel free to give a reason why you think so, or just say yes or no. Either's fine. Alright, so the correct answer is yes, this is death of the author, because fans are prioritizing the text itself over the author's later explanation. Right, next one. A poet claims that the blue curtains in their poem symbolizes grief. The student argues the curtains symbolize freedom instead because of how they are described in the poem. The curtains were indeed blue, and the answer is yes. It is death of the author, because the student is grounding their interpretation in the text, not in the author's intention. Third one. A fan argues that a character's loneliness reflects the author's lonely childhood, and therefore that's what the book is about. Is this death of the author or not? The answer is no, because this relies on author biography to determine meaning. Next, after confusion about an ambiguous ending, the author posts the main character definitely dies. Now, some readers say the ending remains ambiguous because the text does not confirm the death. Is this death of the author or not? The answer is yes, because the readers are rejecting the author's clarification in favor of textual evidence. People refuse to read a novel because the author has expressed offensive views. Death of the author or not? The answer is no. This is about separating the art from the artist, not death of the author. And then the last one. Fans of a TV show argue a character represents childhood trauma. The creators never comment. Death of the author, yes or no? The answer is no, because death of the author only becomes relevant when authorial intention is invoked or rejected. But in this scenario, it's just an interpretation. So, to conclude the panel, the death of the author doesn't mean killing creators. It means recognizing that stories don't live in isolation. They live in us. Because we are expanding meaning, sharing authority, negotiating ownership, and challenging hierarchy when we use death of the author within fandom. Because fandom reveals that art is not static, it's collaborative, it's contested, and it's communal. And so, stories do not end when the book or the TV show or the movie does. They evolve in the hands of those who love them. And so ultimately, I think the answer to whose story is it anyway is that it's ours, but never ours alone. So, thank you everyone for coming to this panel. I hope you found it informative. Um, I would really strongly encourage you to actually go away and read Barthes' entire essay. Either me or my panel aide will link to a resource list in the comments if you would like to read more about Death of the Author and how to use it within fandom. I'm also available the whole weekend, so if you want to discuss anything that I've spoken about in more depth, if you have any questions, feel free to ping me or DM me. I am open to talking, so thank you once again, everyone. I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your con. And bit of a shameless self promo. I am hosting another panel tomorrow. It's the BL storytelling and food panel. I'm really excited about it. It's on a topic that I am really, really passionate about and that I dedicate most of my research to. So I hope you could make it if you're interested. And thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your day or night. Thank you.